Imagine being trapped in a prison you can't see, following rules you never questioned, and living by values that might actually be making you weaker. That's what Friedrich Nietzsche believed most of us are doing with morality. Every time you feel guilty for putting yourself first, every moment you sacrifice your own growth to help others, every instance you hold back your ambitions because it's not the right thing to do, you're reinforcing the bars of this invisible cage. Nietzsche wasn't just some philosopher throwing around wild ideas. He lived this struggle himself. Born into a deeply religious family, he watched his father, a Lutheran pastor, die a slow, painful death when Nietzsche was just a child. This early encounter with suffering shattered his faith and forced him to question everything he'd been taught about morality and goodness. As he grew older, he saw how traditional moral values had turned him and others into timid, guilt-ridden people, always apologizing for their strength, always trying to be good according to others' standards. But here's what's really at stake. What if everything you think makes you a good person is actually a tool designed to keep you weak? Think about it. We praise people who sacrifice themselves for others, who stay humble, who never put themselves first. But Nietzsche noticed something crucial. These virtues all have something in common. They benefit the weak and hold back the strong. It's like we're playing a game where the rules were written by losers to make sure nobody can truly win, and it gets worse. This moral trap isn't just about how we behave, it's rewired our minds. We've internalized these values so deeply that we feel guilty for even thinking about our own greatness. When was the last time you had a bold ambition but immediately shut it down because it seemed selfish? That's the trap at work. We've become so good at policing ourselves that we don't even need others to do it anymore. To understand why Nietzsche saw morality as a trap, we need to look at how these moral systems were created in the first place. Because once you see the origins of our moral values, you'll never look at right and wrong the same way again. This isn't just about breaking rules. It's about understanding who wrote them and why they might not have had your best interests in mind. The story of how morality became a trap starts in ancient times, but its grip on us today is stronger than ever. From the way we raise our children to feel guilty about their natural impulses, to how we judge successful people as morally corrupt, to why we glorify suffering and sacrifice, it's all part of a system that's been thousands of years in the making. And to break free from it, we first need to understand exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes. Let's dive into how morality actually came to be, because this isn't just some abstract philosophical idea. It's a power struggle that shaped our entire civilization. Nietzsche discovered something fascinating when he looked back at ancient societies. He found that originally, the concept of good had nothing to do with being kind or moral. In fact, the first people to call themselves good were the strong, noble warriors and rulers. These powerful figures, let's call them the masters, they simply looked at themselves, liked what they saw, and said, "We are good." To them, good meant things like strength, wealth, health, and power. And bad, that was just their way of describing the weak, poor, and unfortunate. It wasn't even a moral judgment. It was more like saying pathetic or lowly. They didn't hate the weak. They barely even thought about them. But here's where things get really interesting. Those weak people, the ones labeled as bad, they couldn't just accept this situation, but they also couldn't fight back physically. They'd lose. So they did something incredibly clever and dangerous. They created a new kind of morality. This is what Nietzsche calls slave morality, and it's probably the greatest revenge story in human history. These underdogs looked at their powerful masters and said, "You think you're good because you're strong and wealthy? Actually, those things make you evil. True goodness is being poor, humble, and meek." They turned the entire value system upside down. Suddenly, suffering wasn't just unfortunate, it was holy. Weakness became virtuous, revenge became justice, and most brilliantly, they made strength itself feel guilty about being strong. Think about how Christianity, the ultimate example of slave morality according to Nietzsche, transformed natural human instincts into sins. Are you proud of your achievements? That's pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. Do you want to be powerful and successful? Greed and ambition, more sins. Do you enjoy physical pleasures? lust, and gluttony. The natural became unnatural. The healthy became unhealthy. This psychological revolution was so successful that we're still living in its aftermath today. Look at how we talk about rich people. There's always this underlying assumption that they must have done something morally wrong to get their wealth. Or how we teach children that being good means always sharing, always putting others first, never being too proud or too ambitious. We've internalized slave morality so deeply that we don't even recognize it as a historical invention. We think it's just being good. The real kicker? This system works through guilt. The masters could physically force slaves to obey, but slave morality makes people want to obey. It creates what Nietzsche calls bad conscience, that nagging feeling that you're doing something wrong just by pursuing your own interests. It's like an internal police officer, constantly watching and judging your every move. And this isn't just ancient history. Look at modern social media, call-out culture, where people compete to show who's more humble, more aware of their privileges, more willing to apologize for their advantages, or how success often comes with an obligatory story of struggle and hardship, as if you need to prove you suffered enough to deserve it. These are all modern versions of the same old slave morality, still working to tame the strong and make everyone equal, equally weak, that is. This is why Nietzsche saw traditional morality as a trap, because it doesn't just control your actions, it colonizes your mind. It makes you become your own jailer. And the first step to breaking free? Understanding that these moral rules weren't handed down from heaven. They were created by people, for very specific purposes, in a battle that's still going on today. The most dangerous lie we've been told about morality is that it's based on absolute truth. Think about that for a moment. We walk around believing there are these universal moral facts, these commandments written into the fabric of reality. But Nietzsche saw through this illusion, and what he found was mind-blowing. There are no moral facts, only moral interpretations. Look at cannibalism. We consider it one of the ultimate moral taboos, right? But the Aztecs practiced ritual cannibalism as a sacred act. To them, it was morally good. Or take something closer to home, divorce. Just 100 years ago, it was seen as deeply immoral in Western society. Now, it's just a normal part of life. Even something as basic as stealing. We think it's obviously wrong, but ask yourself, would you steal medicine to save your child's life? Suddenly, those clear moral lines start getting blurry. This isn't just about different cultures having different rules. Nietzsche's point goes deeper. He's saying that the very idea of universal morality is nonsense. It's like trying to say there's a universally correct food to eat. Different cultures develop different moral systems based on their needs, circumstances, and power struggles, just like they develop different cuisines. But here's where it gets really interesting and dangerous. People in power have always tried to present their particular moral system as universal truth. Why? Because it's the perfect control mechanism. If you can convince people that your rules aren't just your preferences, but are somehow cosmic laws, they'll police themselves. It's brilliant, really. You don't need guards when people believe breaking your rules means they're violating the natural order of the universe. Think about how this plays out in real life. A CEO makes millions while their workers struggle to make rent. Is this immoral? A traditional Christian morality might say yes, based on teachings about greed. A capitalist morality might say no, arguing they earned it fairly. A socialist morality would call it exploitation. Who's right? According to Nietzsche, that's the wrong question. These aren't facts to be proven. They're perspectives based on different values and interests. This is why one-size-fits-all morality is so dangerous. When we try to force everyone to follow the same moral rules, we're not creating harmony. We're suppressing human diversity and potential. It's like forcing everyone to wear the same size shoes. Sure, it might work okay for some people, but for others, it's crippling. Let's get specific about how this plays out in modern life. Take social media influencers who preach about right and wrong ways to live. They present their lifestyle choices, whether it's veganism, minimalism, or whatever else, as universal moral truths. But what works for a wealthy influencer in Los Angeles might be completely impractical for a single parent in Detroit. The problem isn't the lifestyle choices themselves. It's presenting them as universal moral facts. Or look at how companies push ethical consumerism. They tell you buying their expensive ethical products makes you a good person, while buying cheaper alternatives makes you morally corrupt. But this universal moral standard conveniently ignores that many people can't afford to prioritize ethics over survival. It's a moral system that privileges the wealthy while shaming the poor. The real danger of believing in universal morality isn't just that it's false, it's that it stops us from thinking critically about moral claims. When someone says something is morally wrong, we should always ask, according to whose standards? Serving whose interests? Instead, most of us accept these claims without question, letting others define our values for us. This mental slavery to universal morality creates what Nietzsche calls herd mentality. We become like sheep, all following the same moral rules, never questioning whether these rules actually serve our growth or happiness. We praise conformity and punish independent thinking. Just look at how quickly people get attacked online for questioning popular moral stances, even if they're just asking for a deeper discussion. The way out of this trap isn't to become completely amoral. Instead, Nietzsche suggests something more radical, recognizing that you have the right, even the responsibility, to question moral claims and create your own values. But that's easier said than done, because the price of moral living goes deeper than most people realize. And that's what we need to talk about next. The real tragedy of living by traditional morality isn't just that it's based on lies, it's what it does to your mind and spirit. Nietzsche noticed something disturbing. The more moral a person becomes, the more they seem to suffer internally. It's like a person who's so obsessed with keeping their house clean that they can never relax and enjoy living in it. Let's get specific about how this works. Think about the last time you did something purely for yourself. Maybe you spent money on something expensive or took a day off when others needed you. Even if no one criticized you, you probably felt that nagging voice inside saying, "You should feel guilty." That voice isn't natural. It's installed there by moral conditioning. It's what Nietzsche calls conscience. And it's basically an internal prison guard that never sleeps. This constant self-policing has real consequences. Look at high achievers who can never enjoy their success because they feel guilty about having more than others. Or artists who suppress their controversial ideas because they're afraid of being morally judged. Or even parents who can't set boundaries because they've been taught that putting themselves first is selfish. But here's where it gets really dark. Moral systems don't just make you feel guilty for what you do, they make you feel guilty for what you are. Natural human instincts like ambition, pride, and desire get labeled as sins or character flaws. It's like being punished for being hungry. The result? People walking around feeling ashamed of their most basic drives and emotions. Nietzsche saw how this created what he called sick souls, people so twisted up by moral rules that they become weak and resentful. Look at social justice activists who are so focused on fighting oppression that they become bitter and unable to experience joy. Or religious people so obsessed with being pure that they develop psychological problems. The very systems claiming to make us better often make us worse. The weakening effect of morality is especially clear in how we handle success and power. We've been taught that it's moral to be humble, to downplay our achievements, to feel bad about having advantages. The result? Strong people apologizing for their strength, successful people feeling guilty about their success, leaders afraid to make tough decisions because they might be seen as mean. This shows up everywhere in modern life. Companies promote servant leadership, where bosses are supposed to put everyone else first, then wonder why they can't make hard decisions. Schools teach kids that competition is bad and everyone should be equal, then wonder why students lack ambition. Social movements preach that feeling pride in your achievements is problematic, then wonder why their members are depressed. The cruel irony is that this moral system claims to make us better, but actually makes us less capable of doing good in the world. A person crippled by guilt can't effectively help others. A leader paralyzed by moral anxiety can't make the tough calls that benefit everyone. Someone who's afraid of their own power can't use it responsibly. Look at how many people with resources and influence are afraid to use them because they feel guilty about their privileges. Meanwhile, those with fewer moral restrictions, often the most ruthless, end up with more power because they're not handicapped by these internal conflicts. It's exactly the opposite of what moral systems claim to achieve. This weakening effect isn't just about individuals. It impacts society as a whole. When we praise weakness and condemn strength, when we make people feel guilty for their capabilities and advantages, we create a culture that's less capable of solving real problems. We end up with what Nietzsche calls a slave society, where everyone is equally weak, equally resentful, and equally unable to create positive change. And perhaps most dangerously, this moral system makes us unable to defend ourselves against those who don't share our moral constraints. While we're tied up in knots about whether it's ethical to pursue our interests, others with fewer moral restrictions just take what they want. It's like bringing a moral philosophy book to a fistfight. But if traditional morality is such a trap, what's the alternative? How do we move beyond these crippling constraints without becoming monsters? That's what we need to explore next. Nietzsche's radical vision of life beyond good and evil. Moving beyond traditional morality doesn't mean becoming an evil person. It means something far more challenging and profound. Nietzsche called this ideal the Übermensch, or overman. But don't get hung up on the fancy term. What he's really talking about is someone who has the courage to create their own values, instead of just accepting what society hands them. Think about how children learn morality. We tell them, this is good, this is bad, and they accept it without question. Most people never grow out of this. They just replace their parents with society, religion, or popular opinion as their moral authority. But Nietzsche is saying it's time to grow up, to take responsibility for creating our own values. Here's where it gets practical. Look at someone like Elon Musk. Whether you love him or hate him, he's a perfect example of someone who's moved beyond traditional morality. When everyone said electric cars were impossible, he ignored the consensus. When people said landing rockets was crazy, he did it anyway. He's not bound by conventional ideas of what's possible or proper. Now, this doesn't mean you have to agree with everything he does. That would just be replacing one moral system with another. The point is to recognize how much more is possible when you stop letting others define your limits. But this freedom comes with a heavy price tag: responsibility. When you reject traditional morality, you can't blame society or religion or anyone else for your choices. You have to own them completely. Think about someone starting a controversial business or creating provocative art. They can't hide behind, "I was just following the rules," because they're writing their own rules. This is why most people prefer the comfort of traditional morality. It's easier to follow rules than to think for yourself. It's safer to be told what's right and wrong than to figure it out on your own. But for Nietzsche, this comfort comes at the cost of your potential greatness. Let's get really specific about what life beyond traditional morality looks like. It means judging actions by their consequences, not by predetermined rules. Instead of asking, "Is this moral?" you ask, "Does this serve life? Does this make me stronger? Does this create something valuable?" A simple example. Instead of feeling guilty about cutting toxic people out of your life because family is everything, or friends should stick together, you evaluate relationships based on whether they help or hinder your growth. But here's the crucial point that many people miss about Nietzsche. Creating your own values doesn't mean just doing whatever you want. Actually, it often requires more discipline than following traditional morality. Think about high-level athletes. They don't eat clean and train hard because some moral rule says they should. They do it because it serves their self-chosen purpose. The real challenge isn't breaking free from moral rules. It's creating meaningful values to replace them. Look at people who reject traditional morality but have no higher purpose. They usually end up either miserable or returning to conventional values out of desperation for meaning. The goal isn't freedom from values. It's freedom to create better ones. This is why Nietzsche said God is dead, not as a celebration, but as a warning. When you kill traditional morality, you have to become a god yourself, a creator of values. And that's terrifying. It's like stepping off a marked trail to make your own path through the wilderness. You might get lost, you might make mistakes, but for Nietzsche, that's still better than following someone else's path your whole life. So we're back to where we started, that invisible prison of morality. But now we can see it clearly for what it is, a set of training wheels that humanity once needed, but has outgrown. The question isn't whether to break free, It's whether we're ready for the responsibility that comes with freedom. Because once you see morality as a human creation rather than a divine command, you can never go back to the comfort of simple obedience. And maybe that's the real trap. Not morality itself, but our fear of living without it. We cling to moral rules not because they're true, but because we're afraid of the alternative. The terrifying freedom to create our own meaning in a universe that doesn't come with an instruction manual. Let's wrap this all together and get to the heart of why Nietzsche's insights about morality matter so much today. Remember that invisible prison we talked about at the start? Now you can see its walls clearly. They're built from guilt, reinforced by tradition, and maintained by our own fear of freedom. The truth is, morality isn't what we've been told. It's not some cosmic law handed down from above. It's not a set of universal truths that everyone somehow magically agrees on. Instead, it's more like an ancient piece of software we're all running. One that was written by people who lived in a completely different world, facing completely different challenges. Think about how many of your decisions today were influenced by moral ideas that are thousands of years old. Maybe you felt bad about prioritizing your own goals over helping someone else. Maybe you downplayed your achievements because pride is supposedly a sin. Maybe you stopped yourself from doing something you wanted because that's not what good people do. But here's what makes Nietzsche's message so powerful and so dangerous. He's not just saying morality is fake, do whatever you want. He's saying something much more challenging. If morality is human-made, then humans can make something better. This isn't about becoming immoral, it's about becoming more than moral. The real question isn't whether to accept or reject traditional morality. The real question is, are you ready to take responsibility for creating your own values? Are you prepared to live in a world where because it's right isn't good enough anymore? Where you have to actually think through the consequences of your choices? Some people will hear this message and use it as an excuse for selfishness or cruelty. They're missing the point entirely. Moving beyond traditional morality should make you more responsible, not less. It's the difference between a child who behaves because they're afraid of punishment and an adult who acts thoughtfully because they understand consequences. Look around at our world today. We're facing challenges that ancient moral systems never contemplated. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering. These issues require new ways of thinking about right and wrong. We can't solve 21st century problems with Bronze Age morality. So what now? Nietzsche would say, start questioning. Next time you feel moral guilt, ask yourself where that feeling really comes from. When someone claims something is morally wrong, ask according to whose values? When you make decisions, try basing them on actual consequences rather than preset rules. But most importantly, accept the responsibility that comes with this freedom. Creating your own values isn't easier than following traditional morality. It's much harder. It requires constant thought, careful observation, and the courage to admit when you're wrong. Because in the end, that's what this is all about. Growing up as a species. Moving from blindly accepting moral rules to thoughtfully creating values that actually serve life, growth, and human flourishing. The trap isn't just morality, it's our own reluctance to take on this responsibility. So maybe the real question isn't whether morality is a trap, but whether we're ready to live without its comfortable constraints. Are you ready to think for yourself? To create your own values? To take responsibility for your choices without hiding behind, that's just what we're supposed to do? The prison door is open. Walking through it is up to you.